Yo, everybody. Welcome to Off Panel, a weekly interview podcast about all things comics, brought to you by Sketch.com. I'm your host, David Harper, and we are back! The return of the show brings a writer about comics who does so for sites like Popverse, Wired, Inverse, The Hollywood Reporter, and his very own twice-weekly email newsletter, Comics FYI, amongst others, as well as a rival podcaster on, wait, what? It's Graeme McMillan. Thanks for coming on, Graeme.
I love your pronunciation of wait, what? That was accurate.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I was going to say, because that was going to be my first question, is like, how do you pronounce your name? Is it more of like a ellipsis in the middle, or is it more of like yelling what afterwards, like with an exclamation point at the end?
It's more of a, we didn't really think about it when we named it, and suddenly it's more than a decade later, and we still don't know what we call it.
I really like it. It's a great name.
Well, thank you very much. Jeff Lester, who I did the podcast with, is very good at naming such things. Fanboy Rampage, the first blog I did, 20 odd years ago now, was his name, and I didn't realize it. I didn't realize I'd ripped it off until after the fact, and that was how I met Jeff. He got in touch to be like, "You've stolen my name." And he was right. I had.
I really like to think that he was talking about his actual legal name was Fanboy Rampage, and he had to change his name to Jeff Lester because you had taken it.
Jeff Fanboy Rampage Lester. It's a common name in San Francisco.
Very common, very common. You know, it's funny. I was taking this break. I was taking a few days. I was like in the woods in Alaska where I was doing kind of like I'm going to come up with ideas time. And that sounds way more like I'm on peyote than I mean it to.
No, I love that. It did sound like you're going to a cabin and it was only you and you know, just a screen, and you were just thinking, what can I do? Swell.
I was in like this amazing cabin, and I was just hanging out. Like Scotty Young had done it, and I was like, I got to steal this idea. This is a great idea. And when I was there, I was like texting with a retailer friend of mine, and I was like, you know, what stuff from comic history have you really liked? And he's like, I love Fanboy Rampage. The only Fanboy Rampage I'm aware of, besides Jeff Lester's legal name, is Rich Johnston using it for Bleeding Cool, and then always saying,
it was me. Well, it was Jeff first, and then it was me. It was the start of the comics internet, as it was called back then. So it was 2003 through 2005, I think. I stopped at the 2 year mark, and it was a link blog. It was literally, here's something I've seen on the internet that I think I can be snarky about. I was in a telemarketing job. I was in a telemarketing job, and I was trying to entertain myself, and I had access to the internet, and that was it. There was no plan beyond that. But that was the thing that opened the door to everything that followed.
I feel like 99 out of 100 comics or people who write about comics journalists, whatever you want to call them, start with that exact story. Like mine was, I was in a boring marketing job, and I was like, I need something to entertain myself. I have this blog. I think my family's tired of me writing about comics, so I'm going to start writing for Multiversity Comics. And I did that. Everybody besides Heidi McDonald, who was like, whatever, I was an editor at Vertigo before. I'm like, whatever, Heidi, you're not better than us.
I've edited for DC and Disney. Like, that's what I did before I got into this.
Whatever, Heidi, whatever.
I got Heidi into blogging.
Did you?
Yeah, because Heidi filled in for me in Fanboy Rampage when I went on vacation.
Oh my God, really?
Yes.
This is blowing my mind.
Yeah, I'm the one that got Heidi into blogging. Because I'm that old. It's that long ago. It really is 20 years ago.
So you're to blame for the beat. Thanks. I'm just kidding. I love the beat. I love you, Heidi.
Sorry, everyone.
Well, okay, so most of today's podcast will be catching up on the world of comics after my recent month-long hiatus, in which I spent most of my time just like embedded in a couch watching NBA-related things or, you know, doing other things of that sort. But there's a lot going on, so I want to have Graeme on to discuss some of the bigger topics in comics right now. Before we get into that, I do want to talk about your history because, I mean, you have an even greater secret history than I realized because you got Heidi into this, but you've been doing this for a while. I want to get your perspective on how the landscape has changed since you started, not just for like writing about comics, but just like the nerd culture side of writing. How different does that feel today versus then?
It's so different. It's so dramatically different. The comics internet, when I got into it, again, 2 decades ago now, was literally a collection of people who basically all knew each other. You know, we all at least read each other's blogs, and there was maybe, 20 at most.
Yeah.
There was also a very strong singular culture, if that makes sense. You know, like I remember it being very good because this is the era of like Bill Jameson and Joe Quesada at Marvel. You know, and Mark Millar and the Ultimates, which was a big thing, you know, on the internet at that point. But it was also one of the few Marvel titles that people were willing to like publicly admit that they liked. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
I remember it being like a thing that it felt like the comics internet was very into DC and not Marvel. And then comics took over the world is what happened.
Yeah.
What I laughingly call my career. I sort of track the growth of nerd culture, right? Because I went from writing for myself on a blogspot blog, like, not even my own site. I went from there to writing for Newsarama to then writing for IO9, the Gawker blog. Then I went to Time. Like, it was like I kept jumping to more mainstream sites.
Right.
Do you know, as like the growth of this nerd culture.
Well, there was like 20 of you doing it, so it was really easy to figure out the people who were doing it well. It's just like, okay, whatever. This guy's writing for Time now because no one else knows who Batman is.
Oh, I like IO9. My IO9 thing literally came down to I was in the same city as Anne Lee and Charlie when they were putting the team together.
Wow.
Like, it literally came down to they liked Vampire Rampage, and I had a chance to meet them at an event.
That works out really
Like,
nicely.
it was that lucky. So much of my career is based on luck.
Well, it is really fascinating when you look at it because, okay, you started right when it was basically like the period of Marvel coming back from the bankruptcy. So there was that. And then there was like, God, I'm going to say 2004 was the year where events really started coming back because I think that was when Infinite Crisis started.
That was 2005 or 2006.
Was that? Okay. Well, right in that mid-aughts period was right when like the events really started picking up. Also right then with Scholastic Graphics and First Second launching. Kickstarter was what, 2009, I think?
Yeah, or maybe just after. Yeah, somewhere around
Yeah,
there.
and then you had Webtoon somewhere in there, and you just have all these things that are just popping up, and then the industry just starts changing and changing and changing, and now it's like completely unrecognizable from 20 years ago.
Yeah, but I mean, it's unrecognizable in like the best ways.
Oh yeah,
right.
Yeah,
like,
it's better.
Unrecognizable in that you have Webtoons. Like, I literally just yesterday was putting finishing touches to a story about the digital comics market and ComiXology, and various things to do with that. I'm not going to spoil my own story, but one of the things that I reference in it is like last year the direct market had massive growth, like really really big growth. The Webtoons market had massive growth. The book market is continuing to just have dramatic growth, entirely separate from what we think of direct market publishers. Like Marvel just doesn't exist in the book market anymore.
Right.
But you have the manga, you have the YA, you have middle grade, and that's like a third market. And then you have digital on top of that. There's all these different, not only different ways of getting into comics, there's all these different things to read because each of these markets has their own material. Which is a wonderful thing. Like 20 years ago, that wasn't the case. 20 years ago, manga was like a thing, a subsect that was a smaller thing that people were hoping was going to blow up.
I remember 20 years ago to go into like, do you know what a Walden Books is?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Back in the day when Walden Books existed, I remember going into one of them and like asking, I was like, do you guys have any comics? And this guy looks at me, he's like, we have the German Mouse graphic novel, but that's it. And I was like, okay, I don't think you have comics here. I mean, I was just talking about graphic novels or trade paperbacks and stuff, but nope, they only had Mouse, which is fine. Mouse is great.
But again, now, like, everywhere's comics.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? But, like, I remember in the time I've been doing this, like, DC got into digital comics with CMX. Like, do you even remember CMX?
Do you remember Zuda?
Yes.
I love Zuda.
Yeah, like, there was Minx as well, their YA line that lasted, like, a year, perhaps.
Right.
Like, it lasted 2 seasons, but had amazing material that's way ahead of its time.
Yeah.
There's been all these things that you've seen that when you look back now, you see, oh, look, that was the ingredients. You were just a year too early. Or, that was a misfire, but I can see where you're going.
Yeah.
Like, as much as I think that, Mark Millar and Terry Dodson's Trouble is a terrible comic, you can also see the ingredients for what it could have been.
Yeah.
Right? And you're like,
could have been.
Sure.
I've never read it. I've always.
You're not missing anything.
Okay.
And I don't even mean that in a bitchy sense. I just mean it in the sense of like it doesn't hit what it means to do. And arguably both the writer and artist are the wrong creators for that material. But again, they meant well. Sounds like a strange, like damning with faint praise thing. But there was this moment, especially about 10 years ago, where there was so much potential to do all these different things. And that to some extent it's been squandered by certain publishers.
Yeah,
right.
Absolutely.
But has also grown in all these ways that I couldn't have imagined. I couldn't imagine 10 years ago, never mind 20.
Yeah, it is really crazy. I mean, I had Mark Siegel on recently from First Second, the founder of First Second, and we were talking about how I came across this article, and I think it was 2011, where it was basically like there was an interview with him where basically the person was like, how are you dealing with the demise of comics? And he was like, what?
Yeah, exactly. What demise of comics? But I mean, that's the other thing. You always see that, right?
Oh, it's always doom and gloom.
One of the things that's really strange and interesting for me is There came a point about 3 or 4 years ago where people stopped asking when the superhero movie bust is coming,
Oh yeah.
right? Because everyone expected it to. And then there came a point after a decade where you're like, it's not going away. Like it might fade, but it's never going to go away.
Which is why Disney Plus has a new show like every 2 months, because they want people to never ask that question again. It is always coming forever.
Yes, there's always going to be something.
You know, related to the writing about nerd culture and writing about comics in specific space, like how do you feel like that has gotten better? And like in some ways, has it gotten worse as well? I'm curious in your perspective.
Oh God, what do I say without getting myself in trouble? I think it has gotten worse. I think it's gotten harder. It depends where you want to write and how you want to write. I think the idea of making a living at it, like I do, is distinctly harder than it used to be.
Mm-hmm. Because of breaking in, or because people don't pay?
Both. Like it was easier for me to break in because again, I was one of the few who was doing it, right? And then it becomes a self-perpetuating thing where, at this point, I can legitimately say I've been doing this for 20 years. I've worked for Time, I've worked for Playboy, I've worked for, and just list people. And they go, well, those are names I recognize.
Right.
You got paid by them, like you clearly know what you're doing. Okay. And when I was breaking in, it literally was the case of like, who was writing about this sort of thing? Oh, them, they look good. And that's not the case anymore. In terms of getting paid, I would say it's really hard out there now. I think monetizing journalism in general is hard. Just speaking from personal experience, I know that a lot of mainstream sites are not only changing what they want to write about and what they want to pay for, but also changing who they're going to ask to do it. And so I think for example, I would, just as recently 2 years ago, I was essentially like a permalancer. I was, unofficially staff at THRC Vision, and that let me post daily and let me post announcements of new series. And that's just not something that THR does anymore, And that's not because they're not interested in comics. It's just that, like, that's not what the people who hold the purse strings want to pay for.
Right. Well, it's like a content valuation system to a certain degree.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And I think that for people, I mean, there are various things. For example, I'm writing for Popverse right now, and Popverse is kind of a dream, right? Popverse is, in terms of its aims, in terms of its ambitions, and also in terms of the fact that it's owned by ReadPop and they're putting serious money into it.
Yeah,
is kind of an amazing, I can't quite believe this is real thing that's happening out there. My partner, Chloe Mabille, was running the Neotex Review for a couple of years, and that paid incredibly well and was 100% are you into something really, really, really obscure? Are you into something that like you love but no one else has heard of? Like, pitch it to me and then we'll do something with it. And that published things on Outcasts, the John Wagner, Cam Kennedy miniseries from DC in like 1987 that literally no one remembers.
Right.
And that, again, that paid pretty well as well. And I know that Chloe's talking to people about bringing that back at a similar pay scale. But those opportunities are few and far between. When I came up, there was CBR, there was Newsarama, and there still exists. But I would say that their pay structure hasn't significantly changed since I was coming up. And again, that was a long time ago. But also, the sort of content they're expected to be putting out there and the amount of it is very different.
I think the focus, obviously the focus is from a content standpoint has changed too. It's like my favorite part of CBR for forever was Robot 6. And Robot 6 has been gone for how long? I don't even know, like 8 years? It's hard to even keep track.
If not more.
Yeah.
Like, it might be over a decade.
Oh God, I'm getting too old for this shit, man. What am I doing? I can't believe I shouldn't be Danny Glovering on this podcast. It's too early. It's my first podcast back, but yeah, but it is interesting because it's like, I understand why sites focus on that stuff, but I think that's one of the interesting things though about the writing about comics world is I think a lot of times people, when they talk about how they don't like comic sites, they focus on the big ones to the perhaps unfairness to the smaller sites, because a lot of smaller sites are doing great stuff.
And there's some great stuff out there. Like Panel by Panel is something that couldn't have existed 5 years ago. And Panel by Panel is amazing, right? Women Write About Comics is amazing. There's really, really good stuff out there. Like your site is amazing.
Thank you.
But people don't see that.
Yeah.
People see CBR and Newsarama one of the things I do like about Popverse is it's high profile, and it's still trying to do that sort of writing.
That kind of comes back to one of the big things. I remember for a long time I kept seeing, on occasion, whenever people would be mad at sites, they're like, I remember I would see creators say something like, well, what really needs to happen is somebody needs to like a comic publisher or some sort of entity needs to put money into it so they can support it. And then Read Pop actually did that. I do want to bring that up. So you're a prominent writer for Popverse, the newish Read Pop own comics and pop culture site that just launched. Like, God, it feels like yesterday, but it was a month and a half ago or so.
It was. I'm looking at the calendar. It's just over a month ago as we were recording.
Yeah. So Chris Arendt's running the ship. How did that come together on your end?
Chris left Newsarama at the start of this year.
Mm-hmm.
And I've known Chris for a long time. Again, both of us have been in this for a long time.
Yeah.
And Chris and I have a regular check-in at San Diego where we're both in the press room, and literally we just go over and start going, yeah, how you doing? Yeah, how you doing? And like have the most low-key check-in. So Chris left Newsarama, and I was just like, I couldn't believe it, to be honest, because Chris was there for a long time.
Long time.
If you're including his freelancing, Chris was there for like 18 years.
Mm-hmm.
Chris had an editorial role there. He wasn't just freelancing. Like, he was staff and he was an editor. And so I more or less was like, Chris, what are you doing? And I knew something was up, if that makes sense. Like, I knew he left for something.
Oh, so you didn't know before he departed what he was leaving for?
No, I knew he left for something, and he wouldn't say what it was, because Chris is, if nothing else, someone who knows, like, to keep his cards close to his chest. I was convinced that Chris had left for Substack.
I was too.
I was 100% convinced that Chris has left for Substack.
Me too.
Because you know this as well. Like, Substack have been talking to journalists.
I have no idea what you're talking about, Graeme.
Substack been talking to journalists about putting journalists on the Substack Pro program. Right. And like, I was going to say I could name people, but I'm not going to name people. But there are multiple people I know who have been talked to by Substack. Right. I'm not one of them. I would have sold out in a second. Let me just tell you that right now. So yeah. So I thought Chris had got Substack. And I was like, what are you doing, Chris? What are you doing? And he just kept saying, I can't tell you.
Oh.
I can't tell you what it is. And then after a few weeks, he was like, I still can't tell you what it is, but if there was something, would you be interested?
Mm.
And this was in the end of February, maybe. And we had a pretty extensive conversation about his vision for this still theoretical site. Like, to the longest time, he would not admit he was doing something.
Right.
I was very much on board. He was saying all the right things for my ears. He was referencing things that no longer existed out there that both of us missed, and he was referencing things that both of us would like to see more of.
Yeah.
As like, this is the grand ambition. If this thing existed, because again, he was playing it really cool. If something was going to happen, it should look like this. And I was like, yeah, it should. That'd be great. And then in mid-March or something, he basically said, I'm doing something, but you can't tell anyone about it. But also, would you want to be involved?
Mm-hmm.
And so I started writing stuff for Popverse at the end of March.
Mm.
Like a long time before.
Well, your first piece was like a deep dive, like DC kind of history thing. I'm trying to remember, was it for Dark Crisis? Where it was like
it was Dark Crisis, yeah. It was Dark Crisis. It was written way before like the last issue of Justice League came out, which is really funny. Well, I was like, I know they die. That's good. I can write ahead of this.
You didn't know Captain Carrot would be there, but you knew.
But there's other stuff that like I've written from back then that still hasn't run.
Wow.
Yeah, no, I wrote a lot of stuff ahead of that.
So I think the thing that makes Popverse interesting is there are two things most sites are missing all the time. I mean, we talked about how I'm coming off of hiatus. Part of the reason why is because I needed one of these elements, which is time. Most of the time, when you're so stuck in like the rhythms of the daily grind, it's really hard to get out of that reviews, previews, interviews kind of paradigm. And to like make content that is actually that's too diminishing. I don't mean actually interesting.
But make like content that's evergreen.
Exactly.
In the sense of like you can read it at any point and you find interest in it.
Yes.
I love doing interviews based around a particular project, but there's only a historical interest in looking at someone talking about a miniseries that came out 2 years ago that no one remembers.
Right.
Do you know what I mean? As opposed to, again, going back to something Chloe did. Chloe had like 3-hour conversation with Simon Bisley about his career.
Right. That's awesome.
And that's great. That's the sort of stuff that again, not many people have the time or space to do.
I read a lot of that interview, despite the fact don't judge me. I've had very little familiarity with Simon Bisley's career, and it was really fascinating. I mean, the depth that they were getting into throughout that conversation was really it was rigorous, but in a very interesting way. I don't have 3 hours stamina when it comes to interviews. I've had guests come on, they're like, "We can keep talking." I'm like, "I can't. I'm glad that you can."
Hilariously, that interview was meant to be half an hour.
Oh, okay then.
And they just kept talking.
Sometimes it happens.
And then there was a second call as well, which was hilarious.
Well, so the two things you had Popverse was time and you had money. And I think the interesting thing is, I mean, this is going to make it seem like you have a choose your own adventure type thing going on there to a degree, which maybe you do. But recently your pieces have included you mentioned you have a comiXology piece coming. You've already had a comiXology piece on kind of how things are going there post Insanity. Update is the word that they used. A look into the path of Dark Crisis. I really enjoyed your review of Tilly Walden's Clementine Book 1. Shouts to Tilly Walden, shouts to Clementine, shouts to the worst fans in the history of the world, Telltale Walking Dead. Anyways, I very much have enjoyed what you've been doing, but it's all markedly different from one another, which is also something I like. You're taking a lot of different paths.
Which was one of the things that Chris talked about at the start.
Right. But so what is your purview on there? Is it sort of like your newsletter where you have freedom to find your own stories, or is it something else?
Part of it is that. Part of it is I have a very special, which sounds like euphemism, and it's not, relationship with Popverse and what they're asking me to do, which is there is a certain amount of come up with your material. And basically, if I can sell it to Chris, because I pitch. I pitch the stories to Chris. It's not just that they're like, right, whatever you want. I have to pitch the stories to Chris and Chris and Tiffany, the sub-editor, sorry. If it passes their smell test, then I can go ahead.
Yeah.
Right, and sometimes Chris will come to me and say, "Have you thought about X or Y?" Like the second comiXology related piece came from our conversation about the previous comiXology piece, and we were both like, "Well, why is this thing?"
Yeah, that makes sense.
And I was like, "Yeah, I've always wondered why this thing." Okay, let's write about that. It's really similar to the relationship I have with Wired right now.
Mm-hmm.
My relationship with Wired right now is literally I'm expected to do X numbers of stories a month. What those are is entirely open.
You got to write about For All Mankind. That's all that matters. I love that show.
I just have to pitch my editor at Wired and convince her this is something worthwhile.
Yeah. So, I am interested. This is not me trying to steal your ideas, but I am curious as to with your newsletter, it often feels like you're often responding to stuff to a certain degree. It's like, Zestworld is interesting, so I'm going to write about Zestworld. The latest controversy, I'm going to write about this because it's crazy. Conan going God knows where when it feels like, you're going to write about this because, that's the thing that's happening. I have to admit, there's two things lately that I have not been able to really get myself worked up about in terms of being interested. I don't really care about Conan comics and where they go. And I also don't really care about this Frank Miller, Dan DiDio thing. I'm just like,
Oh, I'm really interested in Frank Miller, Dan DiDio thing.
I mean, it's so weird. And I just
part of it is I like DiDio more than I think anyone else, just on a personal level, but also DiDio's done stuff that is not public and is legitimately for the greater good of comics.
Good.
And so part of me is well, if he I know he's a fan. Do you know what I mean? Have you ever had a conversation with him?
I have not.
I've had a pretty good relationship with him, and one of the things is he's clearly a fan. Sometimes he's so much of a fan that the fan overrules the executive, right?
Yeah.
You look at something like Commandy Challenge, and I love that as a fan.
Right.
And I know that's a passion project. I talked to him about Commandy Challenge 5 years before it came out.
Mm-hmm.
And he was like, "Oh, just wait, I'm doing this."
Yeah.
But it comes from a genuine place. And again, the stuff that's never talked about, stuff that is not my story to tell, but is good stuff.
Yeah.
It's the sort of things that people publicly are like, someone should do this, not realizing that someone has done it.
Oh wow. Yeah.
Right. There's put it this way, there's a reason that creators have, or certain creators I should say, there's a reason that certain creators have such an affection for him. Mm-hmm. And such loyalty to
That's great. Clearly, Frank Miller is one of them. Either that or they just are good business partners. But, I mean, you tackle a lot of things. Sometimes it seems like it's reactionary. Sometimes, obviously, long plans, as you have with Popverse. But what's your idea development like? Do you have an approach to brewing up what's next, or is it responding to what's happening in comics for the most part?
It's twofold. There's a list of things I'm working on, and it depends how close they are to being complete. For example, I was working on an Image Union story for about 4 months, and then by the time I finally got the answer I was looking for, it wasn't a story anymore.
Yeah.
Right, and part of it is the answers I got were good, which made the story go away, which is a thing,
Yeah.
right? Like that's just part of the job. I've got like long brewing things about, like you saw, or maybe you didn't. Did you see Brian Hibbs talking about Diamond?
Oh yeah, it's on my list.
So I'm working on that. I've talked to other retailers and I've talked to Diamond. I could write it up based on what I've got, but part of it is also I think I understand it less after talking to all these different people. Right? There's part of the newsletter for me is literally, I have a question about something, I will try and find the answer. And you might also be interested in this, so come along with it. And part of the joy of the newsletter for me in particular is I feel like the newsletter is a space where I can also leave things as, I don't know what the answer is.
Yeah.
Like, I've asked these questions and I've got this information and I don't know what the end result is, which is a very freeing thing to do as a writer.
My thing, like generally speaking, is I always just say, like, I'm writing about things I'm curious about and I want to find answers to.
Yes.
And now, a quick word from one of off-panel sponsors. Macroverse is a next-generation digital comics platform, and one with an astonishing number of comics, with currently over 50 series from over 100 creators on their app, with a 5-star rating both on Apple and Google's app stores. Download the app and binge all their titles, including the Eisner-nominated Remind from Jason Brubaker, Lisa K. Weber's Hex 11, which has been described as Harry Potter meets Blade Runner, or the new queer supernatural adventure series Husk that launches on November 1st. It's just $4.99 a month to subscribe to Macroverse, with proceeds directly supporting the creators on the platform. Keep an eye on the future of Macroverse 2, as 2022 is going to bring an epic upgrade that offers a new level of digital collectability and more, with early adopters able to sign up for more information at macroverse.com. And now, back to the show. I do think it's really interesting because, like, you're talking about with, like, the Hibbs thing. For listeners that don't know, Brian Hibbs wrote an article about basically how changes at Diamond involving shipping costs and
discount levels.
Yeah, discount levels and everything are making it to the point where single issues are now like a losing game, effectively. I mean, to a certain degree.
Yeah, he basically said that on certain publishers, not only will he not break even on any single issue, he will lose money.
Yeah, exactly. And so I'm doing like a mid-year check-in. I always do like twice yearly check-ins with retailers and just trying to get a feel for the market. And like that's something that's been coming up. And it is interesting because it's like, well, okay, this is a perfect time to jump into it. But I was going to say, like, we're in a really interesting time where comic shops have always been different in the sense that every comic shop is owned by somebody different. And so they're going to have different focuses. But there's so many different approaches that...
Yes.
Hibbs' answer is not necessarily everyone's answer. Also, teaser for next week, Brian Hibbs, the guest on Off Panel. Yeah. But anyways.
Yes. Oh, that'll be fun.
Well, he's been on multiple times. It's been a while.
But just asking about the Diamond stuff will be fun.
Oh, yeah. I mean, he actually heard his name come up multiple times when I talked to James Tynan, and he was like, is it time for us to talk again? And I'm like, yeah, sure, Brian, let's do it. But let's dig into the main event. We're here to talk about a quintet of topics or trends in comics that we find particularly interesting right now. We went through a selection process ahead of time, whittled down to 5. And as the guest, I'll let you choose where we start. Which topic would you like to dive into first?
I mean, we're talking about distribution.
Let's do distribution.
Yeah.
So the topic in general, obviously, is the state of, and when we say distribution, we could talk, I mean, that's the thing is, like, when we talk about distribution for the most part in comics, as will come up later, I think, we have a tendency of having a little myopia when it comes to these topics, single issue oriented, direct issue oriented. And when I say we, I mean the larger industry. But for this, we'll be talking about the state of single issue comics distribution. I mean, Diamond Comic Distributors, Penguin Random House, Lunar. There's been lots of change over the past couple of years, and it's resulted in a lot of all over the place opinions from retailers in regards to each. I feel like depending on who you talk to, Diamond is a disaster, Penguin has paper mache boxes that destroy comics, and Lunar is the enemy DCBS. And yet, in some people's minds, all of them are the best individually. Who knew? It's a super weird space. I'm curious as to what you are hearing on this front and how you're feeling about this part of the market.
I think the only way to really get your head around this is to look at the larger picture, because every retailer you talk to is going to have their own biases. And some of those biases are insane. Like, some of those biases are genuinely nuts. You know, you'll have people talk about how DC has killed the direct market, despite the fact the direct market isn't dead, because DC going away from Diamond meant a year later that Marvel left Diamond, and Marvel leaving Diamond has killed their discounts.
Right.
but DC's to blame, you know, and that's insane.
If there was one piece from Brian's article that I took umbrage on, it was like pinning Diamond's issues, DC and Lunar, which just struck me as very odd because it's like, from the majority of the retailers I talk to tell me that despite the fact that they don't love DCBS being the owner, that Lunar is the best distributor.
Okay, but the other thing is this. Diamond started as a retailer as well.
Right.
Every distribution service in comics started as a retailer.
Mm-hmm.
It's nuts to me that they're like, well, DCBS is the enemy. Sure, all of these companies were your enemies once.
Right.
You know, it's not in Lunar's interests to undersell you. They need you as a customer. It feels paranoid to say, well, that, you know, because Lunar is owned by DCBS, then they are inherently untrustworthy. You know, like,
also they didn't make Diamond bad at their jobs.
Diamond's always been bad at his jobs. That's the thing. Like, no, but Diamond genuinely has been bad at his jobs for a long time. And what's amazing is they now have this competition in Penguin Random House and Lunar, and they don't seem to have stepped up their game.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's crazy making to me. Part of it is though, like, so when lockdown happened and you had DC go to Lunar, and you know things were bad, I was convinced that it was going to be a terrible problem for the industry. I was convinced there was going to be store closure. I was convinced that publishers were going to go out of business. And then you look at last year, and I was wrong. I was 100% wrong. It was very much the opposite.
Mm-hmm.
And so every time something changes, you have people, including myself, thinking, well, this is a disaster. Something's going to go wrong. And the opposite happens. I think that you have to take everything with a grain of salt, especially all the doomsaying. But you also have to look at what everyone's biases are. And honestly, and I don't mean this in a it sounds incredibly pejorative, and I don't actually mean it in a pejorative sense. You have to look at how ridiculous some people's biases are.
Yeah.
You know, like, people might just hate someone at a company and therefore think that company's terrible.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Android Hourman is the best character in DC's history, and nobody wants to listen to me about that because my biases are too much. So
you're right.
It's a great character. Great character.
Yeah, that Top Fire series is so good.
But it's so good. It's so good. Okay, so from the 10,000 foot view, do you feel like things are starting to normalize, or like things are starting to kind of come together? Or is it still kind of like there's fractures there?
I don't think we're going to see normalization for a while.
Yeah.
What I'm expecting Penguin Random House to go after other publishers. I have been told, and it's a story I've not chased down, but I've been told there are reasons why DC is not going to go with Penguin Random House. In part because I'm stunned that DC didn't go with Penguin Random House first. DC had a relationship with them through the book distribution.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I'm shocked that never happened. But apparently there are reasons. Apparently there are internal reasons with both companies why that wouldn't happen.
Well, and most publishers that all the publishers I've talked to that went over to Lunar said their sales have increased since going over to Lunar. Partially, I think that's because they're in like a smaller order. Like, they don't have to compete with everything in Previews magazine.
Yeah. There's a smaller bubble, but also because that Lunar can promote them more.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Right. Yeah, I think Diamond is in a very slow bleed.
Mm-hmm.
I think Diamond is in trouble and doesn't realize it's in trouble because sales overall have increased. But I think, you know, if you see Image going over to Penguin Random House, I think Diamond is going to realize just how bad things are.
Mm-hmm.
And Penguin Random House is clearly trying to sort its stuff out to get other people.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you know, they changed their packaging last month, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And they're basically trying to prove to other publishers that they have their shit together.
Right.
So by the end of this year, I think we're going to see PRH going after Image and probably Dark Horse.
Mm-hmm.
Just to get them over. And then I think Diamond is going to step up.
I think it's interesting though, because so I did a feature which you highlighted in your newsletter, so thank you for that. Like kind of the rise of the middle, the publisher is kind of in the middle. And when I talked to like Philip Sablik from Boom, president and CEO, wait, God, what is it? I don't want to get his title wrong. Sales and marketing. I know that. President, I think. Anyways, sorry, Philip, it's been too long. He said that we love our partners, but he did not resolutely say that. He said that their contracts are now no longer going. Like they're able to keep going with their current partners, but they're also able to do other things. And he didn't say with confidence where they would be. And I'm not saying, this is not me reporting that Boom is going somewhere, but it changes in the air.
I think every publisher should bear that in mind.
Yes.
When Marvel signed with PRH, I surreptitiously talked to a lot of publishers about like, oh, are you going to? Almost everyone gave a variation on we are under contract.
Mm-hmm.
Not we don't want to.
But we are under contract.
But we're under contract.
Right. From what you've heard, like conversations you've had, do you have a feeling as to like a current ranking, like a hierarchy in terms of perceived quality? Not excluding biases, in terms of doing the job.
You mean in terms of like the comics getting there?
Yeah. The thing that they do for a living, theoretically.
Can we say Diamond's at the bottom?
Yes.
Yeah, I'd say it's probably Lunar PRH Diamond.
Yeah.
PRH tends to get things early, which is, I think, for some people a big deal, and for others a disaster.
Yeah, more work up front.
Because some also some stores just don't have the space to keep like that much material in the back store. Because like PRH has been sending stuff out early, like almost a week early in some cases.
I do think one thing that's interesting about how this is working, the funny thing is a lot of retailers miss the days just a single distributor because it's easier, and I don't blame them. It's like when it was just Diamond.
It's easier, and also your discount level's better.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
You're buying more material.
Yeah, exactly. And so your discount level's better. It's easier because you order from one place, and so you just do one order instead of 3 orders. Well, and I say 3 orders, I also mean they have to order from book distributors for like, what Simon & Schuster and Penguin Random House does DC for the book, actually soon doing Marvel for the book, et cetera, et cetera. So there's all these different distributors that they're ordering from. If you bring in non-comics products, they're ordering for so many distributors. But
Sure.
So, some miss that, but I think there is a lot of value to the multi-distributor. And one of them is, I was talking to a retailer recently who told me that they've started shifting some of their book distribution or book like trade paperback and graphic novel orders from Marvel back to Diamond for reorders because Penguin Random House is very inconsistent in that regard. And I think that's one of the nice things about it is you do have options, but I did want to bring in, like, you mentioned Brian Hibbs tilting at Windmill's column on the impact of Diamond's having on single issue margins. I do, like, it's a really interesting place because, like, we're entering into this place where, like, Brian's seeing that, but I don't know if every retailer is because, like, for example, I saw a tweet from Pulp 716, Coffee and Comics. Michael Perlman tweeted me about this, and they sell variants at cover and don't sell back issues out of long boxes or comics online, and they are thriving.
Yeah, I will tell you right now, I talked to retailers about what Brian said, and they just, a couple of them don't understand his math.
Right.
They're like, not only do we not agree, we don't understand how he got there.
I mean, but that's the thing, though, is because all of the discounts and all of the shipping things and everything is so inconsistent shop to shop, it might not make sense.
Well, and shipping is legitimately a problem because Diamond is, I think, the only distributor that charges shipping. PRH definitely doesn't. I don't think Lunar does either.
I think Lunar does.
Does it? I'm not sure. I know PRH does.
Yeah.
But shipping's a big difference if you're on the West Coast,
mm-hmm.
right? You're further away.
Right, absolutely.
If you're in Maryland, you're there.
Right.
Your shipping's probably minimal.
Dude, I live in Alaska.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying, right? Like, then the shipping becomes an issue. So it's going to be different, even if the discounts are exactly the same across retailers, even if the order levels are exactly the same across retailers. Paying shipping becomes a big deal if you are further away.
Yeah.
And so that's one of the reasons why Hibbs and many others are basically asking Diamond pull the shipping costs.
Mm-hmm.
Like, work out some way to factor that in elsewhere.
Well, and I think one of the things is like, I don't remember if he said this in his article, but I know people have brought up the idea of Diamond charging for shipping for profit, not just for shipping costs. And like that is obviously a concern. But I mean, one of the things I was going to get at, though, is I think it's interesting how, you said that other ones don't understand Brian's math. I've heard the same thing. But at the same time, like, every shop is so different. Like, I've been to shops that are the opposite of Pulp 716, where they only sell back issues and thrive. I went to one in Seattle, and like I was like going in because I like checking out comic shops, and I was like, "Where are the new comics?" I was like, "We don't have new comics." And I was like, okay." And then like,
no, there's ones here in Portland. They're the same, and it's like, okay, how are we?
What's that one in the basement? There's like a basement one that is just.
It's gone. It's gone. No. It's such a shame. That did close because of COVID. Yeah, I love that. I think it was called Future Dreams.
Future Dreams, that was it. Yeah. That place was wild. It was so wild. Anyways, it kind of felt like you were walking into like somebody's house that was also a warehouse.
No, Future Dreams is still open. That's one of the basement ones. There's another basement one that's closed.
Too many basement ones.
Future Dreams is great because it's literally a store that you think you might die in because everything is so packed, so high, and it looks so unsafe.
Yeah.
You can't imagine getting crushed by boxes. Yeah.
It's beautiful. It's like the comic dream. But I mean, I also saw Chuck Rosansky email yesterday. I don't know if you subscribe to Mile High Comics' newsletter, but it's great. I'm always fascinated by Chuck's perspective, even though I disagree with it like 85% of the time. But anyways, he bought $1 million worth of some of the most important comics from Marvel's history, presumably to sell them for much more than $1 million. And I think that's part of the reason why it's so hard to track on this stuff is like you're talking about biases. It's not just biases. It's just like business models. Like every business model is so different. And so like the way that you feel the impact of the supply chain or distribution changes or whatever is like dramatically different. Some place like Steve Anderson at Third Eye, that dude's thriving, but like not everyone is Steve Anderson.
but that's just it. There's no such thing as a comics retailer anymore.
No.
Right? Because you can have back issue, because you can have single issues, you can have trades and collections, you can have, a mixture of any of the above.
Mm-hmm.
You can have people who work mostly in merchandise but carry a few new comics. Like, there is no single model of a comic store anymore.
Right. And I think that's great. I mean, honestly, I think that makes comics, in a general sense, like the direct market of comics, more sustainable in my mind, because I don't know, like, have you seen the new Page 45? Like, they completely like redid their shop.
Yeah.
It's beautiful. Only graphic novels and trade paperbacks, and it's just like, it's a bookstore. That's what it is.
No, yeah, I remember, again, this is aging me, but when Rory Root was still alive and he was running Comic Relief in Berkeley, like that, I remember going in there and just being shocked, because it was essentially a bookstore with like a small collection of new comics, but it had things that had been out of print for like decades at that point, and they had multiple copies, and it was someone who'd clearly planned ahead. Someone had clearly gone, oh, this is good work, I will invest in this and I will have copies. And that was just amazing.
Yeah.
Like there are multiple stores like that now. It's just an amazing thing.
This is something I was going to bring up later, but why do you think it is that, like, okay, so if you just look at a math standpoint, long tail for the book market last year was $826 million per Brian Hibbs' own book scan numbers. And then you look at Comicron, you look at John Jackson Miller's numbers, and last year, and it was an estimated $600 million for the direct market. An immense amount of our focus is on the direct market, despite the fact that the book market is undeniably the lead. I mean, is that just like because
it's institutional bias?
Yeah.
It's because when people think about comics, they think about like what's coming out this week, and there's so much like nostalgia and bias in this in general. Like, people still talk about New Comic Book Day is Wednesday, and like DC puts out on Tuesday. Like, there's no reason it should be Wednesday.
I still go on Wednesday.
But that's still New Comic Book Day, right?
Yeah. I also just don't want to go twice.
Well, yeah, sure. Like, you're talking to someone who doesn't even go like a weekly.
Yeah.
And it's such a weird, there's such an odd, like, nostalgic lock on an industry norm that only existed for maybe 15, 20 years. Because before, like, the distributor crash of the 90s, New Comic Book Day was through the weeks. There were multiple distributors, right? Before you lost Heroes World, before you lost Capital.
Did we really lose Heroes World?
Look, someone must have lost Heroes World. Like, there were multiple distributors and there were multiple New Comic Book Days. Right. And then it's only since, 1996, 97.
Yeah.
That like Diamond was who everyone went through, and that became like the sacrosanct law. So when people, in 2020 were like, how can you leave Diamond? Why not? Wednesday's New Comic Book Day. Like, Diamond printed up T-shirts about Wednesday being New Comic Book Day. That's insane, because that has only really been true for 20 years.
I mean, and I think that like the institutional bias thing that comes back to like people's opinions on these distributors too. It's just like, to a certain degree, comics will always be fundamentally built on nostalgia.
Yes.
Understandably, retailers are not immune to that feeling. And so, and also, I don't blame them in some ways. Like, you talk to some of the shops about trying to integrate these new new distributors into their systems without like taking 500 times as long as it used to. I mean, that's
Well, I mean, as much as I personally am like, I think it's great that we have so many distributors. There's competition. Like, they force each other to up their game. I also feel for retailers who go from doing one catalog a month to doing 3.
Yeah. Well, I mean, even beyond that, it's like, I don't even know if I know some shops still have to like manually enter each comic into their system to be able to get like Marvel and DC to a lesser degree, I think, at this point, because Lunar's been around for a bit, but like Marvel stuff in there. And yeah, that's a lot of time. Like, that's been the common
deliveries. There's 3 times as many deliveries as well. Yeah, like, there is legitimate reason to be concerned from a retailer standpoint. I do understand that.
The last topic I want to bring up in regards to this, from what I've heard, the supply chain issues to a certain degree are normalizing in some ways. Like, shops that haven't been able to get manga are starting to be able to get manga to a degree, which is good, but it's still pretty rough in some ways. Like, one of the things I heard from a retailer was that it's not that they can't get things, it's they can't get things at the right time.
Yeah, it's timeliness is what I'm getting. Like, you'll get your delivery, but your delivery is not going to come in when you think it is.
Right.
And that's an issue, because you're going to miss sales windows but you're also going to have pissed off customers who thought that they were going to get it on X and get it on Y.
Well, and also, like, think about the impact. I'm very mixed on the Disney Plus Marvel shows, but what I will say is they have had an impact on sales from the shops that I've talked to. And so, like, you have something like Ms. Marvel, great show. That's the one thing that I can unequivocally say has been great in terms of Marvel's Disney Plus, despite the fact I like 4 of the 5 Loki episodes. But anyways, the interesting thing about that is, like, Ms. Marvel is great and it's going to drive in readers and you're going to have all this impact. But if you can't get the stuff on time, then you can't sell it, and then they go somewhere else and get it where they can. Yep. And that's where the pain, I think, really hits.
Yeah, and especially because there's sunk costs, right? Because it's not just that you don't have the sale, it's that you've already invested that money.
And it's not returnable, yeah. That is tough. But okay, I feel like the natural next step is the book market part of this conversation. We want to talk about the dominance of the book market and its constant growth to the point where it's attracting pretty much everyone.
Even though, like, Marvel just can't get a leg in, which is insane.
We'll get to that. So just to give you a little background, like I said, the direct market generated about $600 million in revenue last year. The long tail, all comics being sold, or all graphic novels and trades in the book market, was $826 million. So it's like the leading light for the industry at this point.
I mean, it is and it isn't, right? Because that number's complicated by the fact that it is the long tail. So it's including, back stock that goes back for multiple years, but also it's including publishers who we wouldn't traditionally think of as comic publishers.
That's true.
And output isn't necessarily comic output. Like DK's in there as well, right? With their encyclopedias, and that's not really comics,
right? Well, I mean, to work off of something you said, like this is, I was going to ask you what has your eye. Instead, I'm going to lead it on this one. I do think it's interesting because one of the most interesting parts of this side of comics, and this goes back to the institutional bias of focus on direct market, is we've really seen a heavy influx of direct market creators like Brian Michael Bendis and Marjorie Liu and Sana Takeda and a range of others, and then also publishers like Vault started Wonderbound, Skybound started Comet, Marvel. So Marvel's interesting because
Marvel's just outsourcing.
They're outsourcing, and that's always been the most bizarre thing to me because it's like they could make it, but they just don't.
I don't think Marvel's interested.
I don't think so either. I mean, I agree. So, but they're outsourcing to Scholastic Graphics, which is smart. Abrams Comic Arts, which is, the funny thing is Abrams Comic Arts, I didn't really even think about them ever until the last couple of years where they started doing a lot of stuff, and it's been interesting. And then DC's doing stuff. I think it's really to me, that's the most interesting side of this, is because it's become so irrefutable that this part is this side of the industry is explosive growth, that now you see, I don't want to say people chasing it, but people pursuing it and opening themselves up to it because they don't want to be left behind. Does that make sense?
I think it's not only that. I think it's that it is now demonstrated that it's not going away.
Right.
So there are creators who have been, curious / wanting to, but also worried that, if I move into this, am I going to lose my work in the direct market, which is guaranteed money.
Right.
Am I going to get this big advance from, McMillan or Abrams or whoever, and then the book is going to completely sink away, and then I've also given up, my Avengers gig to do it, and I've shot myself in the foot. And now, thankfully, you're seeing creators who are doing that. That said, you're seeing creators who aren't, unlike something like Substack, right, where you've seen creators who are, for want of a better way of putting it, big names in the direct market, give up their direct market gig to do Substack. You're not seeing creators give up their direct market gig to do a mainstream book publisher gig. Like Bendis, bless him, is not doing anything major at one of the big 2 publishers anymore. Neither's Marjorie Liu. Liu and Taneka have been doing Monstrous Image, which is great, but also, like, that's it.
Yeah.
Neither of them are giving up. I was trying to think of, like, a big selling Marvel DC book, and my mind literally blanked, and I almost said Deadpool, and I was like, that's not even being published anymore.
What is the last thing? Bendis was writing Justice League last. Like, big selling, Eye of the Beholder.
I mean, it was a high profile title, I guess. But, I mean, even then, he was on Justice League for a year?
Yeah, not much.
Yeah, not that long. I will be curious to see what happens when you see someone like, I would say Tynan, but again, he's gone to Substack. Zdarsky, maybe? Like, leave the big 2 work. and go with a book
I
publisher.
do think it's interesting though. So like, I did a piece on kind of how creators' approaches are changing, like how like the path of a career is changing and everything. And
Hmm.
one thing that I thought was interesting is I talked to Julio Anta, he did Home at Image Comics.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
normally what you would do, like the Kirkman Manifesto that always comes up, that the path was you make a book yourself, and then you go to Marvel and DC, and then
And you make a
you make your
name, and
name,
then
and you come back, and then you take that oomph over there. And the interesting thing is Hulu's doing stuff in the book market now.
yeah. Which honestly, you look at Reina, why not? Or you look at Gene Yang even.
Yeah.
Like Gene Yang, I think is a great model of how to do this because he does balance.
Yes.
His day job, but also the work he's doing for book publishers and the work he's doing inside the direct market.
I thought he wasn't doing his day job anymore.
Oh, maybe he's quit. I haven't talked to him for years.
I think that was like either that or I'm putting way too much into the plot of Dragon Hoops, because it was a decent part of that book was about how he was deciding whether or not he wanted to make comics full time. But either way, yeah, I mean, I think he's the perfect playbook. But it is interesting though, because it's like I know that there's like advances there that you wouldn't be able to get to the same degree in like the book market. There's a little bit more certainty.
You're also working, like if you're working in the book market, like you're working on a significantly advanced time frame. Right? Like the last time, at least I was talking to people at First Second, like they had to have their work finished a couple of years before publication.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
As opposed to direct market where like you can finish your comic like 3 weeks before it comes out.
Yeah. I mean, I had Dave Baker and Nicole Gu on my podcast, and we were talking about Everyone is Tulip, and that book had just come out, and they were already done with their next book, which I think is Forest Hills Bootleg Society, which I don't even know if that's out yet. And like, that's it. It's like 12 to 18 months is like when the promotional window really starts for book market, more like on the 12 side. So you got to have all of it in so you can start doing that. But it is really interesting to see that kind of becoming a next step for direct market creators. But the funny thing is we're talking about these direct market creators, and there's one of two names in my opinion that defines the space: Dav Pilkey or manga. And I don't know. I mean, who do you think defines this space right now?
I mean, it's manga, surely, right? Like it has to be. Dav Pilkey is a force. It's stunning to see how many books he's selling. Mm-hmm. Me as an old man reads them and I'm like, I don't get it. I don't. But like my 9-year-old gets it. He loves them.
Yeah.
Yeah, but he's doing great. But it's manga. Like manga is still like the dominant force in bookstores.
It's so insane.
Like you just look at it. But the question is for me is always like, why? Why is that the case? Like what makes manga so high selling? Mm-hmm. Like what makes fans go towards it? And is there something that Western publishers can basically recreate?
Yeah.
What's one of the reasons the Bendis book looks so interesting to me? Like God, I can't remember the name of the artist who's doing it with.
Andre Lima. God, yeah. I'm gonna get yelled at by a friend of mine, but Araujo. I don't remember how to pronounce his last name. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry.
Yeah, I would do an even worse job of. So we're gonna go with you. But like that book, I think that book looks like maybe not a cynical attempt to get into that space, but definitely something that both of them have thought this is a book market book as opposed to a direct market book.
Right.
And I think that's smart. If nothing else, Bendis I think has always been very smart about knowing where to place his books and where to target his books.
Yeah.
And so I'm really curious to see how that's going to perform for him.
Yeah, I'm really interested in that too. I had a conversation with somebody at a publisher once about what could be learned from manga. And it is interesting because it's like, you look at manga, I mean, in a lot of ways, there's no difference between that and like how superhero comics works. It's all serialized. Mm-hmm. It's all like big stories and big emotions. And then I think the two main differences in my mind is accessibility, because it's just, I mean, it literally is just start with first volume and then just go on into infinity. Mm-hmm. And then on top of that, it's accessibility of price, because it's like you get the tankobons and it's like what, $7.99, $9.99 for this like very satisfying chunk.
It's not only that. I think honestly the satisfying chunk element is really important as well.
Yeah.
I mean, even trades these days are like 5 issues, which is 100 pages of content, which isn't a lot, and especially not for the money. Like manga is.
I'm pointing at my manga right now. Directly
gesturing behind. No, but manga it's a chunk of story for not that much investment, but also I think that there's an additional difference of, I'm trying to think of a good way of saying this. I think manga as a whole looks at an interiority. That's not even a word. Like,
I get it.
Like an emotional sense of the story in a way that Western comics like almost reject.
Mm-hmm.
I think Western comics this is how we're dealing with relationships. This is how we're dealing with emotions. And it's a very stylized, formal idea of it. Mm-hmm. And manga is about how does the story feel?
Right.
Like everything. And like, My Hero Academia as much as anything else. Like any romance manga and My Hero Academia, Attack on Titan are the same thing. They're all about how does the story make me feel? How do the characters in the story feel? And I think that's key to a specific audience who want the emotional journey.
Right.
And I can think of a handful of American comics that do that well, but it's a handful.
Well, and I also think, I mean, to a certain degree, it's like when you read, so I am a Naoki Urasawa mark. I know that's very cliche because like everybody who's first getting into manga is, but he's really good at what he does. And the thing that's also really nice too is like you read like 20th Century Boys, or you read like Azadora, or if you read like My Hero Academia. I haven't read My Hero Academia, but I imagine this is true. There's also a cohesion to the story that makes it work a little bit better. You go in and it's not all of a sudden going to have a different artist. You go in and it's not going to all of a sudden have like a fill-in single issue or something like that. So there's that cohesiveness of vision that stays consistent throughout, where you're always going to get this from like, Urasawa's perspective or whomever's. And I think that helps a lot because it's going to maintain that quality, but it's also going to maintain that feel you're talking about, where you feel that emotion or you feel that plot or whatever.
It's like this is maybe too much of a leap, but I think one of the titles in the Western industry that does what we're talking about really well is Saga.
Oh yeah.
And I think the success of Saga sort of points to, if you do it right, if you do it well, you have an audience that sticks with you. Saga fucked up for 4 years and came back, and people were like, "Oh, I'm buying comics again because Saga's come back."
Yeah.
Right? Like, I think if you do that, I think if you do have, like you said, the consistency of vision, I think if you do have the emotional journey, and you that with the fantastic elements, I don't think it's enough just to have the emotional journey. I think you have to have, something that you can't get in other media necessarily.
I agree with that.
I think that when you marry those things together, you do have this magical ritual. If someone could put Saga out in really cheap volumes and chunks, and I mean cheap volumes, what would happen there? I'd be really curious.
You know what this makes me think of? Brian K. Vaughan, one of his most notable books in his career. He's got a lot of notable books, but
I was going to say, come on. He's got a lot of notable books in his career. Runaways, right?
Runaways, yeah. Digest. That book wasn't a hit until the Digest books came out. And the funny thing is from what I understand, a lot of retailers hated that volume because they were a weird shape and it made it weird to put up on their stands. But those were a hit. And it was because it was doing exactly what you're talking about, which was a smaller, cheaper book that was more affordable for people to read. Yeah. And it was how the book became a hit.
Yeah, I'd love to see what would happen if they reformatted Saga.
Yeah,
and went here's 300 pages of Saga for $10. Go.
You know who's smart about this though? Everyone's always mixed on him, but Robert Kirkman was very smart in the fact that he is basically constantly remixing The Walking Dead into a million different formats and continuing to make money off of it.
Look, Kirkman's a genius for getting Tilly Walden on Clementine. That feels like the greatest thing that could have happened to The Walking Dead. Like that book is amazing, and as someone who doesn't like The Walking Dead, like I love that book because I love Tilly Walden.
It's so good.
But if you like The Walking Dead, it still works. If you don't care about zombies, it still works. It is aimed at a whole new audience. It's like Kirkman is a smart guy.
This is terrible. I still remember where I was when I heard that she was going to be doing Clementine. I was in a weird like hotel mall on the Vegas Strip, and I got an email from Sean Makowitz because I was doing a feature, and he was just like, "I know you like Tilly Walden, but she's doing Clementine book 1." I'm like, "Oh my god, I'm gonna die! I'm like, "Can I talk to Tilly?" And they're like,
"Yeah, it was genius. It was genius.
It's so smart.
It was such a smart choice."
Yeah, I mean, it's perfect casting. Yeah. I think if I remember correctly, it was actually Alex Antone who decided, or who pitched Tilly on that. But either way, whoever did it, you're all smart. But okay, last question of the bookmark before we move on. Is there anything else that has your eye in this space? I mean, that is one of the interesting things. I'm sorry I'm asking a question and immediately jumping into a thought, but the interesting thing is you read Brian Hibbs's book, and Brian Hibbs is like the theme of the day. Brian Hibbs's book scan numbers, and you look at it, and like the average book in the long tail sells like 660 copies. So there's a massive divide between like Pilkey with like 1.75 million copies or whatever of the latest Dogman, and like the ones like down below.
Yeah, but the ones down below is like literally backstop.
Yeah.
Right? It's just that it's still earning money, which in itself
is amazing.
Exactly. In itself is still like a sign of the health of the book market. I do wonder what the direct market would look like if you actually tracked like that.
I mean, can you imagine trying to track back issue sales? That would be impossible. It'd be insane.
No, that's what I'm saying. Like that would be fascinating. That would be fascinating to see. Other things to look at the book market is this sounds terrible. I'm waiting for Image to actually work the book market properly because Image should be much bigger in the book market than it is.
They're making some hires in that regard, and they've been smart about the library stuff recently. Like they hired Chloe Ramos for that, and I think I believe it's Chloe Ramos, and is doing a very good job with like the library stuff. But I agree.
Image should be really big there. I'm always surprised they're not.
Yeah, I mean they were when Walking Dead was at its peak and Saga. I mean,
No, but again, Image and Walking Dead and Saga were big.
Yeah.
Like Image as a publisher should be bigger because they have such a backlist.
Yeah, it's true.
And they have such a variety of material. It's crazy that they have like a couple of breakout books, like Monstrous is a breakout book. Why are other things not breakout books?
I don't know. What do you think should be a breakout book?
I'm still waiting for Zero to become a breakout book, and Zero's like a lot of years old now. Like Alice Got Zero.
No offense, but you will be waiting forever for that.
No, like Alice Got Zero is one of those things that like 10 years from now people are going to be like, oh man. And I say that as someone who thinks that he fell apart at the end, but like the
early stuff is amazing.
The first because it only ran 18 issues, 15 issues. Like I would say it's solid all the way up to like the last issue. I think it's one of those series that like the last issue didn't land it, but everything else is amazing.
Yeah, I remember the Trad Moore issue being really good. I think it was like number 4.
There's so much good stuff in Zero.
Yeah. And now, a quick word from one of off-panel sponsors. It's Bad Idea still. I have good news. They got back to me on a script for an ad. I also have bad news. They told me to come up with it because they're busy baking. So I hear they're making donuts now? I don't know what's going on. Bad Idea is over. Let's get back to the podcast. Okay, so let's move on. One of the big topics we have to talk about, especially given the fact that while I was gone, Joe Quesada decided to leave Marvel because he knew I was going on a break.
Okay, I have a question.
Yeah.
Why is this a big deal to you?
It's not. I was just joking. I'm just being dramatic.
But like Quesada's not been a figure at Marvel for a while.
Right.
I know there's the whole rumors that he was like shadow running it instead of CB, but like Joe's not really been a big figure at Marvel for a while.
We're going to get back to this in a second. I'm going to do my little spiel, and then I'm going to jump into a very important question. So DC and Marvel, post Dan DiDio and Joe Quesada, interesting place for them to be in as the big people behind them for a while left over the past couple years.
Yes.
Left. Dan DiDio did not leave. He left, but it was not his choice. That brings up a question. All right, so you introduced it. Who's actually running the ship at Marvel? Your bet.
Dan Buckley.
No. David Gabriel.
David wishes he was running a ship at Marvel.
I don't know. You look at that platform, I bet the person who's making the biggest decisions, I mean, obviously Dan Buckley is the one who guides the thing overall, but...
the real answer, Kevin Feige.
Yeah.
Kevin Feige.
Do you think so?
Yeah, not intentionally.
Okay, because the movie 16.
He's not meaning to, but Marvel is continually just following the TV and movies now.
Yeah.
So by implication, he's running.
And
Marvel.
They do technically report to him now, right?
Yeah. No, they don't. He's chief creative officer. So no.
Okay, so everybody reports to Buckley.
Yes.
You know what's funny? I, for a long time, have thought that Dan Buckley was just basically the comic book equivalent of like the Abominable Snowman or like a Sasquatch, and that like I've never
that he didn't actually exist.
I've only seen one picture of him, and I'm like, this is not a real person. Like you're gonna find a stock photo years later, and it's just Dan Buckley, and you're like, that person's not real.
Yeah, it's an AI. It's one of those AI portraits.
Every time somebody comes up with like a oral history, like I did my Secret Wars one, and Dan Buckley kept coming up. I'm like, all right, use a real person, people. Come on, what are you talking about?
Yeah, I mean, Feige's probably the one running Marvel. But Marvel's being run by trying to tie in with like the larger corporate agenda. And there's nothing wrong with that.
Right.
It's just that's what it is. Like you look at what they announce, you look at what they do.
Mm-hmm. Well, the reason why I said Gabriel, who's for listeners that don't know, the sales and marketing person there, like the one that's running that. I mean, he's event guy, he's variant guy. And those are like the flavors that have really been driving them for the last while.
I was going to say what event, and I remember Judgment Day is coming.
Judgment Axe. Respect the axe.
Axe Judgment Day.
Why couldn't it just be Judgment Day? Why does it have to have the axe? I mean, I guess it's...
I like axe. Axe is
yeah,
fun.
Avengers.
Also, there have been so many other Judgment Days in comics.
That's true. You got to have the axe in there. But anyways, I don't know. It is really interesting, though, because there are a number of things that are kind of fueling what Marvel's doing right now, where it feels like it is sales and marketing driven, but you're right, there is that element. Not to make this like a DC versus Marvel thing, because I'm not that type of guy, Graham. I'm not really into like the vendetta between the two. I like everybody, but DC to me is clearly ahead right now in terms of doing interesting things and doing so in a cohesive, consistent way.
Not to make it into a DC versus Marvel thing, but DC's ahead.
Yeah, exactly. I feel like a lot of Marvel stuff feels like, I've been saying this for years, it just lacks cohesion. It doesn't like really have that connective tissue the line normally has.
It sounds terrible. I think Marvel likes Vision.
I agree with that.
And honestly, I think it's like Vision since CB's gotten in there. And I don't think it's necessarily CB's fault.
Interesting.
And I say that as someone who doesn't necessarily have the highest regard for CB in general.
Sure.
Like when CB got the job, I was genuinely like, why?
Right.
Like, at what point in his career, at any point, did you think he would be a good EIC? But I think
creators really love him.
I think Axel was pushed aside because things weren't working.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that was the point where people in charge of Marvel just decided that no, we'd just rather have publishing support the other stuff.
Right.
You know, and so I think that's just what it is now. Marvel publishing supports Marvel movies and Marvel shows.
Mm-hmm.
And Marvel video games and Marvel, parks or anything else.
I find it really fascinating, though, because like part of the reason why, in my opinion, the Marvel Cinematic Universe has been as successful as it is because they've done a very good job. I mean, everyone's, pro or con, plus or minus, whatever on the MCU. But when they're at their best, they're doing a really good job of taking notable Marvel stories from the comics and basically capturing a very pure version of it that like streamlines it. It's like Infinity War and Endgame is like the Infinity Gauntlet to a degree. Well, Infinity War in particular is like the Infinity Gauntlet story, but it's like done in a way that's accessible. Like, but the thing is like I find the movies and shows affecting the line to be fascinating because like now the tail's wagging the dog.
Yes, and there's where's the material coming from? For 10 years from now in the movies.
Right. Exactly.
Right. And that's something that I'm really curious about because and I have no insider information, I'm not like, spoiling anything here, but if the next thing is Secret Wars, if the next movie is Secret Wars, which is the big belief.
Yeah.
Secret Wars was really recent.
Right.
Right. You've moved from material published in 1992 to material published in like 2015.
Right.
Okay. Where are you getting your next big storyline from?
Mm-hmm.
Because you're burning through Ms. Marvel right now. You're burning through the Ellis/Lemire Smallwood Moon Knight right now. And that's stuff that's been published in the last decade.
Right.
Where's the new thing that you're going to be doing? Because when your publishing line is based on these guys are in the movies and TV shows and in the parks, we'll tell new stories about them. But you as a studio have cycled through those actors and can't bring them back.
Right.
Where do you go?
Stiltman. Let's go. I was just going to say, I had a reported insider tell me that Stiltman was going to be in Armor Wars. And I was just like, that's so stupid. I love it. Let's go. I want it to happen.
Look, Kite Man's getting his own HBO thing, so why not?
Noonan's, baby. Let's go on Hitman, too. Tommy Monahan, Nat the Hat. I love Hitman.
But like for real, DC is doing more interesting things. Like in a number of levels, I think DC is doing more interesting things. Mm-hmm. But one of the things they're doing is their YA and middle grade line is introducing new characters.
Right.
Right. And I think that's something that is necessary for. I don't want to make it sound like it's all just IP mining, but you are going to be looking for new characters to do. And don't get me wrong, DC has a far wider like unmined field.
Android Arrowman.
Characters, but the idea that you're coming up with new characters now still, like again, Naomi was just made last year.
Yeah.
And Naomi the characters is just again less than a decade old.
Well, what the fascinating thing is like when I look at DC you could argue has the same problem that Marvel does that I just said, the lack of cohesion to like their main superhero line. I don't know if that's totally true, but I mean there is.
I would say that's not been true since Future
State. Yeah. I mean there is the cohesion to a certain degree, but the focus isn't there the same amount. And I think it's because I think DC's been really smart because they have an array of approaches. Like Marvel's just Marvel Universe 616. That's what it is. But DC's got Black Label. They're doing the Webtoon stuff. They have a lot of minis, a lot of anthologies, a lot of one-shots, a lot of really interesting atypical approaches. And it all seems to be working. Would some retailers disagree with me on that? Sure.
Yeah.
Do I think that Dark Crisis has had very little conversation for an event? Yeah. But I like their approach. And I see.
Yeah. And also like it works creatively, right?
Yes.
Like Dark Crisis feels like looking down the line that it's going to be a successful book,
mm-hmm.
right? In a way that like Heroes in Crisis which I really enjoy, even though it's a mess, like doesn't like you. It's really difficult to sell anyone new on Heroes in Crisis, right?
Yeah.
Because you're like, here's like I'm going to try and explain the plot of Heroes in Crisis to you. Actually, never mind.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas Dark Crisis is very simple. Like, oh look, the Justice League's gone and everything is going to hell, but there's a big plot and go.
I like it. Actually, I've only read the first issue. Yeah.
I love Dark Crisis. I think the lead up to it was really good.
Yeah.
I think the Infinite Frontier miniseries and the Justice League Infinite series were great lead ups to it as well. I think it's been a really good build. It's very lead up to Infinite Crisis, but that's not a bad thing.
Yes, I've always said that the lead up to Infinite Crisis is the perfect playbook for rolling out an event. It's so smart.
And Josh knows that. Like,
oh, I know.
Josh is doing this very intentionally.
Yes, I mean he is basically like doing an event about events. And I mean that with respect. Josh knows I support that. And it's a good book, though. And also, I can't even tell you the last time I read a DC event. I don't even know. I mean, like, Heroes in Crisis is just like a Tom King special. It's not an event. It's just...
Heroes in Crisis is just fascinating.
It's its own thing. I'm going to have a retailer yell at me. I can already predict this because he's just like, Heroes in Crisis, no! Anyways, all right, we got to jump into the last two topics because we are running long. Which one do you want to start with? Because I know that these two are together in your mind. We have creators as publishers, brands, or digital disruption.
I mean, they're the same thing, right? Digital disruption, I think, really ultimately is you're looking at the people like Substack. You're looking at different companies. Because in terms of ComiXology, that's disrupted in and of itself. Like, that's just kind of a mess right now. With the Amazon update, quote unquote. You know, I just
Was it 4.0? What was the number? 4.666.
I don't know.
Yeah.
No, but like that's no one yet knows what that means. Right. The biggest surprise to me was that I was convinced sales would fall, and I've had multiple publishers say no, they fell and then came straight back up, which is nuts to me because.
Okay, let's start there. I'm going to do a quick introduction. So we're talking about digital disruption in the comics industry. Everything is changing here. ComiXology is a mess after their update. DC Universe Infinite opened up to Europe, et cetera, et cetera. Marvel Limited's tweaking their formula with their weird Infinity comics that are, you know, Webtoon, but not Webtoon. Tapas was bought. Webtoon's making people mad with ad campaigns, and everybody loves Hoopla. Yay, Hoopla.
Yeah, what's wrong with Hoopla? Hoopla's great.
Hoopla's great. So what's going on? What's your read?
The Webtoons commercials were just, like, that's its own separate thing. That's just a dumb ad campaign, right?
I just had it made. It was something I missed. Yeah. I have to say, I liked the one that was like, all of a sudden it was 3 a.m. or whatever. I was like, that's relatable. I thought that was pretty smart. The rest of them, no.
Sure, but that was like that was the least offensive one.
Oh, I know. The rest of them were just like, what are you guys doing?
Weird Literature Side Hustle was just, oh man. How was that not killed at the planning stage? Come on.
Swing and a miss.
No, but like the ComiXology thing is fascinating because by essentially getting rid of the ComiXology site and also getting rid of the last in-app purchases from Android users means you have to go to Amazon.com now. And Amazon.com is not an intuitive sales front for comics at all. It's really bad. And so I was convinced sales would have fallen. And multiple publishers said, yeah, it did, and then it came back up, which is nuts. It makes no sense to me.
So you had that piece recently on Popverse, what's happened since Amazon's ComiXology overhaul and how it's affected sales. I am interested in like why you think that is. You had two ideas in there. I think it was only game in town or customers are adjusting. Which one would you blame more? Blame. Whatever.
Blame is the right way. I think it's the only game in town.
Yeah.
I think ComiXology really benefits from the fact that there's nowhere else for you to go on outside of piracy if you want to get digital copies of new comics.
Yeah.
And I think that as soon as someone works out an alternative, they are going to kill.
Do you really think that's going to happen?
No.
Yeah. Okay.
Here's the thing. Someone could do it. I don't think anyone wants to do it.
First, you have to build it. Then you have to sell publishers on it. And then you actually have to convince readers to do it. Those are 3 huge steps.
I think publishers are ready to be sold on something serious.
I think some are.
Yeah, I think there's nothing. I mean, let's face it. There's every 2 years you could get someone else being like, "We're revolutionizing digital comics," and it's always like, "We've got Dynamite and IDW."
It's always the same.
Dark Horse.
I think this ties into part of the problem is the digital download aspect of digital, like ComiXology sales and things like that, has largely been flat for the last like 5 or 6 years. There was a spike last year. I think it was up to 160 after pretty much being flat at like 90 or 100 for like half a decade. And I think that the reason why a lot of these, like Marvel and DC, do they care about this? Do they make more money off of the all-you-can-eat subscription services? I don't know. We have no insight into those numbers. Maybe you do.
Yeah, we have no insight. Anecdotally, both companies are very happy with their subscription services.
And I think the reason why they don't care is because it's free money that comes into them, and it just is what it is. And I think that a lot of, I mean, like, you talked to Damien Wassel at Vault. I mean, he probably told you the same thing. It's not a huge chunk of their money. No. It's not that they don't care about it, but it's just like you can only put so much effort into something like that when it just doesn't produce that much for you.
I got told by one of the big two publishers that digital sales had essentially not grown since 2011, which is crazy. No, but think about it. You have the subscription services, right? Like, unless you desperately want to read something the day it comes out, okay? If you have a busy life, you can wait 3 months to read something in Marvel Unlimited.
Yeah.
Like, there are books coming out in Marvel Unlimited that I have forgotten came out, and I am behind enough, like, unintentionally.
Right.
I'm like, oh, I don't need to buy this. It's right there.
Douglas Woke is so mad at you right now.
Douglas Woke's always mad at me. What?
I mean, it is really interesting. Like the direct download part does feel like it's kind of like the tradition or the distribution thing where we were talking about, where it's like the direct market gets the focus, and that is the apparatus we mostly focus on. But it's interesting because like the subscription model stuff, I think, really leads the way. Even ComiXology Unlimited, well, Kindle Unlimited or whatever the hell it is now. But on top of that too, it's like it's interesting because you can make a really strong argument for Webtoon being the biggest part of the digital space. The only thing we've talked about so far is they made a dumb ad campaign.
Yeah, but I mean, that's because otherwise, honestly, the biggest takeaway from the ad campaign for me really was the fact that they kept talking about adaptations and streaming.
Yeah.
And it's like, you're showing your ass. You're basically saying that's what you care about, you know? And, you know, again, there's nothing wrong with that. Like, there's entire direct market publishers who are more or less happy to say, yeah, we're just mining IP.
The thing I don't understand about that
for adaptation,
though, is like, from what I understand, their originals deal, like, Rachel Smythe retains the rights to Lore Olympus. What are they getting out of that?
I mean, they probably have first right refusal on adaptations.
Oh, okay. That's pretty good then.
Right? That's the deal on every print publisher I can think of outside of Image and Rebellion.
Mm-hmm.
Like, every creator-owned book includes a first refusal on media rights.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where the money can be, right? So, you know, why not? Webtoons and web comics is a massive space that is not really looked at. You know, and I think it's something that people are going to have to start looking at, because, you know, digital comics is in ComiXology is, you know, it's maybe shrinking. It's definitely not growing.
Yeah.
And I think there's reasons for that. I think there are things that I'm, again, not going to talk about. I just wrote the story yesterday. Are
you sure you don't want to talk about it?
I'm sure I don't.
I'm just kidding.
No, but I think there are reasons for it, but I also think it is a stagnant market.
Yeah.
I think that you want to look at the Webtoons, you want to look at Tapas. Like, Tapas made some really fascinating hires.
They also got bought.
And then, fascinatingly, like, one of the more interesting hires disappeared off to IDW.
Right.
Like, Jamie Rich going over to Tapas made me go, oh, that's really worth paying attention to. You know, Michelle Wells is there as well. I was like, okay, like, you know, I trust Michelle. I think Michelle's, you know, a really smart hire. Jamie going over there is really smart. And then Jamie's like, I'm off to IDW. And I was like, I wonder what's going on at Tapas.
I think Chris Robinson from Marvel's there too.
Yeah, I think he is.
Yeah, it's interesting. Okay, so the last topic we're going to bring up is creators as, like, publishers brands, which would, like, kind of encompasses Substack.
Okay, so I have a question for you.
Sure.
I'm sure you're subscribed to a number of Substacks.
Yes.
How many of them do you really genuinely look forward to and pay attention and like? I'm not going to ask you to name names.
I mean, I don't subscribe to a lot of them, but I would say I really enjoy Brian K. Vaughan's write-ups. They're always, I mean, Brian K. Vaughan, I think, is the best at writing for the medium, which is unsurprising because Brian K. Vaughan's good at everything. And I also really like Spectators, so that helps. I really like Public Domain, so I enjoyed Chip's one. And also, Chip's just always really charming. And I'm going to admit, I'm a process nerd. I love reading the stuff from Three Worlds, Three Moons when it comes, especially to the mics.
You're the first person I know who's actually been like, I love Three Worlds, Three Moons.
I love the process stuff. Like, seeing the...
I know so many people who've been turned off by just so much process stuff in that.
Oh, yeah. No, I mean...
Like, that is 100%. It is, and this sounds cattier than it's meant to. It's very much a Jonathan Hickman newsletter in that respect.
Well, and the funny thing is it's also the most successful.
Yeah. Is it?
Yeah. It's number one if you sort by paid subscribers.
I thought Tiny was number one.
Nope. Well, also Three Worlds, Three Moons sells all the time.
Yes. But also Three Worlds, Three Moons, like, has... If you sign up, you get things,
right,
which others don't.
Right. Exactly.
Like, if you want the hardcover, you have to sign up. Like, I'm really fascinated by this sort of era of creators as brands.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's really interesting to see people try and make the leap. It's a modern version of the image movement from the 90s, right? Where it's like the creators are the important thing. It's not the stories. But I also think that a lot of the Substacks are not as, you can see who's good at Substack and who isn't, I guess is what I'm saying.
Sure.
And I think that people are showing that they aren't.
Right. I do think, one thing that's interesting about this is like the focus is obviously on Substack because the money goes in there. Boom. Exclusives with publishers like.
It's a lot of money.
Yeah, a lot of money. Exclusives with like publishers like Jeff Lemire signing with Image, just like the Brubaker and Phillips deal. Scott Snyder's deal with ComiXology. But a person I really like, they're very good at what they do and they're very smart about this. Liana Kangas is like a really fascinating person to look at in this space because they stream, podcast, make merch, do all kinds of stuff. It's this very broad idea of a comic creator. Still makes comics, makes covers, makes comics, working on a graphic novel right now. And it's really interesting to see because it really reframes everything around Liana without being like craven about it, if that makes sense. Yeah. And it's interesting because when I was brewing up topics for this podcast, a creator pitched me this one, and Substack was gonna be on the list one way or another, but I thought like the broader idea was interesting. Why do you think this is growing? Do you think it's like a pandemic thing, or do you think it's just an opportunity thing?
I think it's an opportunity thing. I think the Substack, I think the tech companies in general, like I think the influx of outsider money has been coming in. Outsider sounds ridiculous. It sounds gatekeepery, but like money from outside of the comics industry has been, there for a while. You look at something like Artstrides and Artisans getting funding.
Look at CGC getting bought.
Like people are looking for ways in, okay, but they can't buy the characters. They're never going to get Spider-Man. They're never going to get Captain America. They're never going to get Batman. So where do you go after that? You do go to the creators. Mm-hmm. Okay, and then you have, like I said, the Image thing, where like the creators are the stars. It's the most obvious go-to. Because the alternative is what? You set up a company and then the company is going to, succeed or fail. Again, AWA has a lot of great talent there, and no one talks about AWA books.
Yep.
And there's been like good AWA books. There's been not good AWA books, but there's been good AWA books that people just aren't talking about. Mm-hmm. That if they came out from somewhere else, they would have been talked about.
Well, I mean, they published them on Webtoon and they went nowhere. Actually, they published them on Tapas too. Although, I mean, if you could design a publisher that's subject matter would not be fitting of Webtoon, number one on the list might be AWA. Webtoon's not like dying for Mike Diodato art, but no offense, I'm Mike Diodato, I love you, but no. It is interesting though because I feel like the shape of a comic creator's career has shifted so much. I mean, obviously, since you started writing about comics, like James Tynion would have been a Martian. Like, look at what James Tynion's doing.
Oh no, it's insane. Looking at what Tynion's doing, look at what Hickman's doing. Like what Three Worlds, Three Moons hiring Stephen Wacker was a moment
from an executive position at Marvel.
Yeah, was a moment where I was like, okay, so they're like serious about this. Mm-hmm. Like this isn't just we'll see how it goes until the money runs out. And don't get me wrong, I know it's serious money. I know if you were just looking for the money to run out, you could really make a go of it. You could go for quite some time. But seeing things like that, I feel like you can see people who are really trying to play with the possibilities, and I think Tynion's there as well. And you're seeing people who are just like, we'll see what happens. And I said, I was going to be really mean. I was going to say, I love Grant's newsletter, and yet,
yeah.
I like Grant Morrison's newsletter is my favorite Substack newsletters, mm-hmm. but part of that is it's messy and you're just seeing what they're doing.
Right. Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like Grant is literally sitting down and being like, "What am I going to write about today? Da, 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 da. Here's some offcuts for Super Gods." Da, 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 da. Like, great, good on you, Grant. It's going to be messy and I love it. But it's very different from seeing what Three Worlds, Three Moons is doing. It's very different from seeing what Tynion's doing.
Well, I mean, that goes back to like we were talking about with retailers, where it's like everyone's going to have a different flavor. It is interesting seeing basically what happens when, all right, so we're going to give you a boatload of money. All you got to do is like make sure you post 2 times a week. Go. And everyone's like comes up with wildly different approaches. But
also, who's thinking long term?
Right.
Well, who's trying to do something that will not even necessarily be profitable, but be worthwhile 10 years from now.
I know it was buried in one of the posts you probably didn't read, but did you see Three Worlds, Three Moons post about their numbers and the fact that they're sticking around for the second year for sure?
Yep.
Yeah. 2,300 paid subscribers, 10,000 free subscribers. And that was a while ago. And it was interesting to see that. I did think it was interesting. I heard from like a number of people on Twitter when I speculated like that's a worthwhile thing, and they're like, I did the math. There's no way that math's out to pay for everything. I'm like, this is not all that they do. Like Mike Del Mundo does a ton of covers.
No, but also like they can do other things.
And they're going to turn this into print eventually too.
Yes, exactly. They can sell what they are creating for this. If this underwrites the creation of something they will then sell that will pay. When Substack first announced and, everyone came on board, there was a whole thing where people were like, this is terrible. Like, this is, how dare you work for Substack? Substack's a terrible company, which, it's a whole different conversation. But people were like, why would anyone sign up for Substack? And for me, I was always like, because it underwrites you. So basically you have a significant amount of material that you can then sell for free.
Right.
Like, you get to do the image deal, but you don't have to put any of your own money up front.
My argument in the very first post I wrote about this is the biggest winner that isn't directly related with the deal was Eric Stevenson.
Right? Because where else are the books going to go?
Yeah, all these books now have page rates that they couldn't pay, and they just take them over to Image, and they just sell them, and they're just making... This is crazy because...
It's free money. Like, taking it to Image is free money.
All the book sales are now gravy, which is crazy. Or at least for these ones.
Yeah.
Once the grant's out, it'll be interesting to see who sticks around. And that's coming in August. I have a feature I'm working on for this, and it'll be really interesting to see. But
I wonder who's going to publicly say if they get a second year of the grant.
No one. I will say that. Who is really interesting you in this regard? Are there players? I mean, Tynan, obviously, but is anybody else that's not just Substack? I just mean the brand thing.
I'm really curious what Scott Snyder's doing counterintuitively, because Scott has the Amazon deal and he also took the Substack deal.
He's got deals everywhere.
And he's using Substack, to basically like underwrite his teaching, which is, not a bad idea, because Snyder, as much as anything, has made a pretty good hold of being someone who remains a teacher. Like he was doing the DC Talent program for 3 years.
Yep.
Outside of like the paid thing, like I do think Liana is a great example of a creator who, like, them.
Right.
That's much you know their work. Do you know what I mean? Even if you don't know Liana's work, you follow Liana on Twitter because she's fucking hilarious.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to think. Chip's great.
Yeah.
And I think Chip was a brand even before Substack or anything came about. Like, you knew we were getting with Chip. Chip had like a public persona. Do you know what I mean? And it was a public persona that wasn't, I was going to say wasn't an asshole, but I guess was like a comedy asshole is what I'm looking at. Like, it was very much a character that was a fun character to follow.
His Substack's fascinating though, because like, and I mean this in the most lovable way, but his newsletter didn't really change once it became paid. It just started adding comics to it. So you get Kaptara and you get public domain and stuff like that. For the most part, it's still the same cadences and rhythms and enjoyability, but we want access to that, so we pay for it. And so
yeah,
that's what we're talking about here.
No, but exactly. Like there are creators who, and I think Morrison did this before, years ago. Like Morrison, remember Morrison Con was like 15 years ago.
God.
Where there was an entire convention based around one person. So Creators' brand. I mean, Creators' brand has always been there.
Right.
Frank Miller, you talked about earlier. Frank Miller's, Mark Miller. Creators' brand has always been present. It's just that now they're in the space to monetize their brand.
Mm-hmm. There's mechanics for you to do this.
Change.
Yeah.
Which is the change. You're now in a space to be like, and again, it's interesting to see, like Tom King is doing Love Everlasting, right? It's not just the Tom King show.
Elsa.
Vaughn's doing Spectator, right? It's not just like welcome to the Brian K. Vaughan show, and it's that's also what's interesting. See the creators who are shying away from literally turning themselves into a brand as opposed to trying to build a brand,
right?
Tynan's kind of splitting the difference. Tiny Onion is a brand, but it's also very much the Jim show.
Right. I think, for me, one other interesting player, and then we got to go here in a second, but Elsa Chartier has been very smart about this.
Who's been doing it for years, again.
Yeah, Kickstarter, using Kickstarter really in smart ways.
I mean, if you look at crowdfunding, you're looking at like Spike as well.
Spike, of course.
You look at Iron Circus.
Yeah.
There are a bunch of people who've been out there doing similar things. What's also interesting is, we're talking about Liana, we're talking about Elsa, we're talking about Spike. Like, it's not men that are successful at this,
right?
Which I think is a really hopeful thing, for want of a better way of putting it.
Yeah,
like it's proof that it's not always the same people who are going to be successful making comics, and that there are. I was going to say better comic creators out there, which sounds maybe mean, but like there is, it's not a token thing, I guess is what I'm saying. It's not like, let's support them because they're not men. It's like, let's support them because they're fucking great.
Right. I mean, I think that's a fundamental change from when you first started, is like, there's more room for people in different ways. And like, you can approach it book market, you can do it digital, you can do it as a brand, you can do all these. I mean, like, probably the best at it in terms of just the pure brand stuff, Jen Bartel's incredible about it.
Yeah. That's true.
And Jen Bartel hasn't done. Well, I mean, I guess Jen got a Substack grant, so it is really interesting to see all that. And I agree with you. I mean, I'm hopeful for it. I think that we like with all this stuff. I mean, that's one of the interesting things is like I think for the last few years we've been in a point of transition, and I don't think that transition's stopping anytime soon.
Oh no, we're in flux, and we're going to be in flux for a few years.
Yeah, I don't know where that stops, but it'll be really interesting to see where it goes.
I don't think there is a stop. I think the new normal is just that things are going to constantly be evolving.
I love it. Well, Graeme, that is all I have for you. Thank you so much for coming on for this constantly evolving conversation about comics, your career, and everything else. I appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Off Panel with comics journalist Graeme McMillan. You can find his work on sites like Popverse and Wired, as well as his email newsletter, Comics FYI, and his podcast, Wait What? Big thanks to Deanna Chapman as well, who edited this podcast and made it sound as good as it does. Love Off Panel, want to support it? Subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts today and give the show a rating or review while you're at it, but 5 stars only. You can also support the show by backing it on Patreon. Find the show at patreon.com/offpanel, and when you back it on there, you get early access to each week's podcast as well as weekly content and more. Want even more? Subscribe to my subscription comic site Sketched at sketch.com for long-form articles, features, interviews, and the rest of the site's content. You can find Off Panel and Sketched on social media by following it on Twitter and Instagram at SketchComic or following me at @SliceFriedGold. Big thanks to all my existing patrons, including Jason Wood, Tom Peachy, Guido, Ben Damstead, Rom Veet, Devin Fitzsimons, Nick Walker, Patrick Hoyle, Isaac Warren, Scott Carpenter, Rent Narb Studios Comics, Capes and Ties Podcast, Klaus Vandevent, Brian, Submit Industries, Jack Mulqueen, Kyle, Carl Kerschel, Robert Masella, Elza Chartier, Luke Nakashoji, Elliot Metz, Dr. Luke, Scott Hazelwood, Scott Buwan, Canadian by Proxy, Johnny Cannon, Bradley Rader, Carl Troy, Brandon DePillis, Patrick Brower, Declan Shalvey, Dan Guarino, Josh Williamson, Adam Freeman, Ben Wild, Brian Klein Q, SB, Nick Bennett, Daniel Whitfield, Susanna Pulla, Reed Hinkley Barnes, Mario Tiambang, Andrew Carita, Matt Mahoney, Charlie Chu, Stephen Hall, Pensacola Pop Comics, Philip Myra, Christian Sheldon, Kenny Porter, Chris Pacello, Torrin Grunenbeck, Fuzz Bubbles, Christopher Todd, Transmitter Down, Waltz Comics and Books, Carl Mizell, Paul Salates, Akil Wilson, Alex Dimitriopoulos, Terry Dodson, Wesley Giff, Sean Kirkham, Alistair Ross, Julio Anta, Brett A. Schmidt, Jason Goodmanson, Paul Ryanwan, Vita Ayala, Tara Ferguson, Dave Slusher, WMQ Comics, Akil, Ken Heidelman, Philip Seavey, Al Ewing, Ryan Alcock, David Kelly, Robert Wilson IV, Nick Polito, Brendan Fletcher, Jonathan Nilsson, Matthew Groom, Jason Massey, Adam Bogart, Matthew Taylor, Nick Patera, Jacob Sorelli, Ford Gilmore, Dave Baraldi, Nick Hall, Bjorn Basin, John Hendricks, Steve Anderson, Ian Maxfield, Cliff Chang, Colin McMahon, Chris Palmer, Scott McGovern, Nathan Fairburn, Adam Highfield, Fiona Staples, Mark Abbott, Mike Murphy, Michael Shirley, Tom Barnett, Jim Demonakos, Norbert, Nick Lowe, James Kaplan, and Mission Comics and Art in San Francisco. You guys are all the best. A quick thanks to Upright T-Rex Music, who wrote and performed Off Panel's theme song just for the show. Check out their music on Spotify because it's completely delightful. Thanks for listening, and tune in next week for another episode.